Mullarky, I was trying to figure out who this guy was and what motivated him to take the kind of photos he took, because even though he definitely fits into the category of a frontier photographer, definitely engaging in this sort of boosterism, definitely monetizing these photos of Native people for his own purposes, he couldn't help himself. And he ended up taking some of the most remarkable photos I've seen of this time period in ways that really undermined the establishment story of come to New Mexico to see real Native people before they die. And Mullarky certainly took photos that contributed to that, but he couldn't help himself. And he took these photos that ended up telling a much different story.
Bienvenidos. This is Encounter Culture from the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. I'm your host and editor of El Palacio magazine, Emily Withnall. I first met David Correia in the Palace of the Governor's photo archives at the New Mexico History Museum. He had pitched me a story about the Gallup Coal Wars and said he had access to never-before-seen photographs of the dramatic events that took place in Gallup between 1933 and 1935. I was intrigued and arranged to meet him at the archives, where the Thomas Mullarky photo collection had recently been donated, so I could see the photos firsthand. I don't know what I was expecting, but Mullarky's cinematic and unconventional images raised more questions than they answered. After we met, David did write an article for El Palacio about the Gallup Coal Wars. You can find a link to the article and the Mullarky photos that accompany it in the show notes. But for the purposes of our conversation on encounter culture, I wanted to dig into who Mullarky was, what he was doing in Gallup, and what we can know from looking at his photos. As the editor of El Palacio magazine, I spend a lot of time thinking about history, what we know, how we know these histories, and whose perspective these histories reflect. Since I began my tenure as editor and as host of Encounter Culture, I've been very interested in the process of identifying and bringing to light the lesser-known histories in New Mexico. This isn't an easy task. A lot of the time I spend thinking about history, I am thinking about what I don't know, what is missing from the archive, and why. Uncovering history across New Mexico is a little like putting together an enormous jigsaw puzzle without having a reference image or all of the pieces. In fact, it's impossible to know how many pieces there are. Although this might sound like a fool's errand, the process of unearthing previously unknown stories and perspectives does help to bring the fuller picture of the state's story into sharper focus. And importantly, it leads to more questions, which lead to more research. As you will hear in my conversation with David Correia, Mullarky's unusual photographs of various events in Gallup in the 1930s upend traditional frontier photography and present new avenues for research. Welcome, David, to Encounter Culture. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Emily. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start off by having you introduce yourself, what you do, what your areas of interest and expertise are in terms of your research and your books that you've been writing.
I'm a writer and a professor at the University of New Mexico. For the last 17 years, I've been at UNM. I'm currently in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. I'm an historical geographer, so most of the stuff that I write about focuses on the past. I have a couple books focused on New Mexico's history, particularly the colonial history in New Mexico. But I've also written about, more recently, labor history, particularly stories about strikes and conflicts between workers and bosses. And my work is, I would say, a bit unusual. It's not the kind of geography that most people think of when they imagine what a geographer is or what a geographer does. I spend my time in the archives, and that's where the stories I write about come from mostly.
I like that you said that because that's where we met. We met at
the archives.
Yes, we met in the archives at the Palace of Governor's archives to talk about Thomas Mullarky's photos from the 1930s. And you wrote an article for the fall issue of El Palacio that touched on some of his photos.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk about all of his photos today. But can you give listeners just a teaser of that article?
Oh, sure, yeah. The piece in El Palacio is a story about maybe one of the most dramatic labor struggles in U.S. history in the 20th century. The 1933 to 1935 Gallup Coal War is a really remarkable story. It was a strike by coal miners in Gallup. The governor declared martial law, sent in the troops, shut down Gallup for months. There was this incredible backlash against the miners. They eschewed the United Mine Workers, who they thought were too conservative and had treated them poorly in a previous strike, and went with a communist union that was affiliated with the Soviet Union. This is kind of like a prehistory of the Red Scare as well. And the story tells really the full arc of the story that concludes with the assassination of the McKinley County Sheriff in 1935 and the crackdown that happens after that and all the arrests and deportations that occurred. I mean, they were arresting miners and just putting them on trains and sending them right across the border to Mexico, deporting them. They were arresting organizers and evicting them from the state of New Mexico. It was really a pretty dramatic story, but we didn't really have to worry too much about capturing the drama in text because the photos are really remarkable. And as you mentioned at the beginning, the photos come from the William Thomas Mullarky photo collection, which is now available at the New Mexico History Museum Photo Archive, which was just donated a little over a year ago, actually, which is how I came to start working with them. And I guess in some ways, the story of the Thomas Mullarky collection begins with the Gallup Coal War because the photos are so remarkable.
Right.
But,
and before you dive into that, I just want to say to listeners, sometimes I have mentioned various articles in this issue, and I'll talk about the Gallup Coal Wars, and I'll see people like their eyes glaze over a little bit because that kind of a history, unless you're really into history, doesn't sound interesting on the surface. But I just want to tell listeners that this is very dynamically written. If there are any TV producers who want to turn this into a TV series, that was my first thought when I read the first draft that David sent me. So it's definitely very gripping. There's a lot of drama and action.
And also incredible like figures. I mean, I remember I wrote a part of a draft that you told me to get rid of was the kind of the bio of the Adjutant General of New Mexico, Osborne Wood, who his story is incredible. His dad was this famous war hero, Leonard Wood. And you're like, there was so much interesting about it. Even some of the most interesting stuff just didn't find its way into the story. And Mullarky, the photographer of the Coal War, is probably the most interesting, and he didn't figure in at all.
Right.
That's why we're here, though.
That's why we're here. Yes,
right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And before we dive into his history, I actually want to know, what do you know about photographers in the West during this time and what their role was in their communities? Or specific to Gallup, if you want to go there. But what were they doing in these camera shops? Because I wouldn't necessarily associate a camera shop owner with like being on the ground during dramatic political events.
Yeah, I think Mullarky was unique. In some respects, he was unique. But there was a certain role played in the early 20th century by these camera shop owners in like frontier towns. And I think if anyone is familiar with photography in the West or the Southwest, they're familiar with some names like Edward Sheriff Curtis and others like him. And so Mullarky does fit in that category to some degree. He's not known at all, and partly that's a result of the fact that his photos were just embargoed, really until, I think this is the first time his photos have appeared in print in El Palacio. But photographers like Edward Sheriff Curtis and others were, like we're talking about late 19th century, early 20th century photography. Photography as a field wasn't very common. There weren't a lot of people that could engage in it. It was a technical enterprise. It required some investment, some training. So there weren't a lot of people that knew how to take photos. Cost quite a bit to have to haul that equipment around and to develop film. When you look at photos, particularly from the U.S. Southwest in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they tend to fit into a category of what photography historians would call like frontier photography. There's the landscape shots, this idea of this like open, empty landscape ready for white settlers to inhabit. And then the photos like Edward Sheriff Curtis took, and also Mullarky took, of Native people. And often those photos contribute to the kind of like frontier aesthetic of American expansion, American exceptionalism, which depicted Native people usually as like one of two things, either obstacles to progress or victims of progress, or as like kind of romantic objects for tourist exploration, which is sort of one of the roles that Mullarky filled. And so you wouldn't think these like small town camera shop owners would be a part of that project, but they were actually the heart of the project because they made their money in multiple ways. One was portraits, when people first started having their portraits taken, so they would come to these camera shops. to have their portraits taken. Camera shop owners like Mullarky did sell film and did sell equipment, but that wasn't a very lucrative part of his business. Almost all camera shop owners in the early 20th century in towns out west made a lot of money as like boosters, right? There was some sort of whatever the town booster like aesthetic was, they were at the heart of it. So a lot of Mullarky's clients were local business owners who were advertising in the paper, and Mullarky took photos of their businesses or street scenes. So there's a lot of street scenes, photos of buildings in Gallup from the early 20th century.
Yeah, and I actually want to have you say, like, who was he?
Yeah.
And how did he end up in Gallup?
I want to go through all that.
Okay.
And I want to preface it by saying, like, we're going to eventually get to describing some of his photos. And they're really what's worth this.
Yes.
So if anyone listening, just wait till we get to the part. This all makes sense because I think it is important to know who this character was and how he got there. So yeah, he was not from New Mexico. Mullarky was born in the late 1800s, 1897. He was in the early 20th century working with an Imperial Valley photographer named Leo Hetzel, who he did a lot of like surfer photos, and like Hetzel was there at the beginning of urbanization in the Imperial Valley in California. And like Mullarky after him and all the photographers that came before him, he was documenting the sort of settlement of the West and the native people that they were displacing. And so that's where Mullarky was trained. This was just like an occupation, right? That's like the camera shop owner. And the camera shop owners, the way they made most of their money was by monetizing the photos they took. So in addition to like portraits, in addition to clients, like local businessmen, and whatever sales they would have in their shop, they would take photos of the surrounding landscape or native people, and then they would monetize those. The obvious way to monetize it was postcards or attaching yourself to some sort of promotional or tourist event. And so Gallup becomes a really lucrative place for all of this. Mullarky is like actually the third camera shop owner in Gallup. The first is this brother, Simeon Schwemberger, who starts taking photos with the equipment at the St. Michael's Mission in Arizona in like 1902, decides he doesn't like being a brother anymore, which was just a lot of drudgery and like cleaning and cooking. So he leaves the order and buys a camera shop, opens a camera shop in Gallup in like 1909, I think. And actually, the UNM Press published a book of his photos, Simeon Schwemberger's photos. It's called Big Eye. And the photos are interesting. He was a portraitist, first and foremost. He wasn't an artist. The goal wasn't like art, it was commerce. Like he was trying to monetize the photos he took. He's the one that starts developing these photos into postcards as like car traffic. He becomes an Indian trader, like a lot of white settlers, businessmen do. And so he sells his camera shop to a guy named J.R. Willis. J.R. Willis, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that famous photograph of like New Mexico in multicolored, where it's like the big block letters, New Mexico.
Yes.
That's J.R. Willis's design and his photos in the background. And he was like a prolific photographer he was a painter also. And Willis was in Gallup doing portraits and taking photos. And monetizing all of this until, I guess it was about early 1920s. And Mullarky had come west. He couldn't, he wanted his own studio. He wanted to leave California. And so he was just driving through New Mexico and he stops, and there's multiple stories. Many of these are myths because there's not a lot of information on Mullarky because his photos have been embargoed for so long. But he ends up buying Willis's studio, and he gets to New Mexico, at least for someone with his interest, at the right time. At the time, the Gallup was just beginning its intertribal Gallup ceremonial. So the Gallup intertribal ceremonial is a powwow. It happens in late summer. I think the first one was in like 1921. So right about the time that Mullarky arrives. And it was a tourist event owned and run by the Chamber of Commerce, designed to attract tourists to New Mexico by attracting native people from all over the West and Southwest to come and engage in performances. And at the time, it was a kind of a rough event. But most of the photos in Mullarky's collection aren't of the Gallup Coal War that I write about in El Palacio, but instead most of them are photos he took during the intertribal ceremonial various years. And there are thousands of photos lost. There's probably more that have been lost than are in the collection because there was a flood in the 70s in the studio that they lost a lot of his photos. But, he was a member of the Chamber of Commerce. He was a local booster. He actually served on the organizing committee for the intertribal ceremonial, but he was also its official photographer. And then he would monetize all this by putting them on postcards and selling them to the tourists that came every year for the event.
So, how did you first learn about this collection and what drew you to it? And I understand you were pursuing it and couldn't
Oh, yeah,
access it
yeah.
until relatively
I'm,
recently.
I'm sure I'm one of many people over the years, historians, other scholars, who've tried to get their hands on these photos. I think it was almost 20 years ago. I
Mhm.
was in the Center for Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico campus in the archives. And I was working on my first book, which was a book about the Tierra Maria land grant. And I don't know how I got into the collection of these photos, but they have a small collection there of about a dozen of Mullarky's pictures from that are just on the coal strike for 1933 and 1935. And at the time, I was unfamiliar with that story, that history. There's really not a lot written about New Mexico's labor history, particularly the sort of radical labor history, like the National Miners Union that I write about in El Palacio, which is this really radical labor union that was openly communist and organizing mostly non-English speaking miners at the time. And the photos just blew me away. It's hard to do it justice over the air. I mean, you have to see these photos. They're really remarkable. But Mullarky was a portraitist, and he somehow brought that aesthetic out of the studio so that his street scenes and scenes of marching soldiers and scenes of hired goons with guns rounding up miners, they all look like portraits somehow. It's just really remarkable. I just saw these photos. I was like, I've never seen photos this amazing. I mean, they just brought to life, as you said, you've told people oh, you should read this story about the Gallup Coal Strike, and people's eyes glaze over. If you see the photos, your eyes are not going to glaze over. You're like, what's happening here? Also, photos of the organizers, the young woman who was the primary organizer of the strike, Martha Roberts, 21 years old. There's these great photos of her in the middle of a crowd, just standing in front of hundreds and hundreds of people, holding their attention and giving these rousing speeches. And she organized thousands of people in this short time before they deported her. And he captured all of it. He was there for all of it. Usually when you find a photo collection in an archive, the archive owns the copyright. And usually for a scholar who's doing some sort of academic project, the cost of using photos is negligible. It just covers their expenses, $25 a photo or something like that. But they didn't own copyright. They just had the name and number of the guy who did. Mullarky died in 1959. And I guess in 1960, his family or estate sold the camera shop and all of his photos. They'd taken his entire life to this family, the Guadagnolis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, actually. Anyone from Gallup that's listening, my apologies. And he never, ever let anyone use the photos. So I called him and he explained who I was and that I wanted to inquire about whether or not I could use these photos in a future book project. And I explained that it would be with an academic press. No one's out to make money, And I don't remember the number he quoted me, but it was thousands of dollars per photo that he wanted. It would escalate too, if depending on the sales. He wanted a cut of sales and he wanted all this money. And I was just you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
I've never in my life, I've published 6 books and there's photos in all these books, and I've had conversations with so many people about copyright and using permissions for photos. And I was just shocked because the photos are so amazing. Why would you not want these photos displayed? And so there was just no way that I could pay that.
Did he say why he didn't want?
He was pretty gruff. He
Okay.
was he struck me as a kind of I was it was it was bothering him, He was just what's this guy wanting? No, it was he just quoted me a figure. And when I said no, he's okay, bye. Yeah, I just gave up. I was whatever, And then about a year ago, I get an email from the archivist, the photo archivists in Santa Fe, asking me if I'd like to come in. They'd just been gifted a photo collection about the Gallup Coal War, and they wanted to know if I would help them work through the collections toward publication of some sort. They wanted to do an exhibition. The guy who I talked to had passed away, and the state decided to sell them, and there was some sort of bidding war, actually. The couple that bought it specifically, I think for the same reason. They must have had the same experience I'd had. They knew how amazing these photos were. And so they bought everything that existed that had survived over the years. It's about 12 boxes. And they asked if I would come in because the couple that had donated it to the photo archive in Santa Fe donated under the condition that the archivists quickly process the collection and find someone who will help them present the material through publication or exhibition or a book, with a focus on the Gallup Coal Strike in particular. That's actually why I pitched the idea to you about the Gallup Coal War.
Right.
Because that was part of the conditions. They like me, were so struck by these photos that they wanted them out in the world, and we wanted people to see the photos and learn this history. So I drove up to Santa Fe to look at them, and I spent a few months going through them because they were just plates, They were negatives. And so it was like kind of painstaking work just to be able to sort of make heads or tails out of all these photos. There were no notes. A few of them were dated. No names of people. And so it took a while to go through them. And at first it was just identifying which are the ones from the coal strike. And as you know from reading the story of the coal strike, it's really two stories. It's the strike, it's 1933, and then it's the backlash in 35 after the killing of the sheriff, which they blamed on the striking miners and the roundup and all the violence against the striking miners. The archivist in Santa Fe didn't know that I was familiar with those. And I was like, I think these are going to be and they were. I was like, oh my God. So 70 of the photos in the collection are from the Gallup Coal War. We're calling it a coal war because it's not just a strike. It's much larger. It ends up becoming this huge sort of conflict between like working people, particularly like non-English speaking folks that had been brought to Gallup to work in the mines, and police and local business leaders. But I went through the entire collection and I was equally blown away by the rest of the material. And that's what we should talk about, because the rest of the material is really incredible. I've spent the last year since getting in there really trying to immerse myself, not just in, that time period in Gallup, but also like the context in which Mullarky would be taking photos. And also Mullarky, I was trying to figure out who this guy was and like what motivated him to take the kind of photos he took, because even though he definitely fits into that kind of category of a frontier photographer, definitely engaging in this sort of boosterism, definitely monetizing these photos of Native people for his own purposes and for promotional purposes for the intertribal ceremonial, which didn't serve the interest of Native people, it served the interest of business leaders in Gallup. He couldn't help himself, and he ended up taking some of the most remarkable photos I've seen of this time period, like 1920s and 30s, in ways that really undermined the establishment story of like the white saviors and like, oh, come to New Mexico to see real Native people before they die. Like that's the usual promotional story that drew tourists to New Mexico in the early 20th century. Come to this tourist event and you'll be able to see real Native people. You'll understand their life ways before this dying race of people forever disappears. Like that was the kind of draw and the promotional pitch that made the intertribal ceremonial such a huge tourist event. And Mullarky certainly took photos that contributed to that theme, but he couldn't help himself. And he took these photos, just like he couldn't help himself with the Gallup Coal War. Like he took photos that ended up telling a much different story, because his Coal Wars pictures don't make the business elite come out looking all that well. His Coal War photos really celebrate working people's struggles. Yeah. And he was in no way on paper someone you would imagine would take photos like this.
So did you discover any answers or clues as to why he was spending this time and money undermining some of his other work?
Well, I did figure out why he took the Gallup Coal War photos. He was hired by the court.
Oh.
Yeah, in the course of the story that I tell in El Palacio, as I mentioned, the sheriff was assassinated. And when I was reading in the archives, I found sort of passages referencing Mullarky's job to take crime scene photos. And I don't know if you saw them, Emily, but there's a series of photos in his collection that are very much like crime scene photos of just like tire tracks on pavement. And I was like, well, that's a silly photo for Mullarky to take. Like, so it turns out he was hired to take photos by the court and by the sheriff's department. That explains the 1935 photos after the sheriff was assassinated. Again, a lot of records were lost, and Guadagnoli like never released a lot of records, and they didn't keep track of the photos very well. But my guess is that, and this is how most, border town camera shop owners made their living. Like they were just hired by someone needed photos taken, and they just asked the only person in town with a camera is the camera shop owner. So he was hired to take these photos documenting the strike. Maybe the National Guard hired him, or the court, or the coal mine owners. But he couldn't help himself, and he took these photos in ways that revealed the hypocrisy of the police crackdown and the martial law. There was three categories. I'll give you examples of how he undermines it. One would be the way in which photography was understood and viewed by people at the time, right? It was, photography is a mediated activity. Like, you and I looking at a photo or seeing whatever that photographer wanted us to see, right? Like all the choices they make about who's in the scene, who's in the frame and who's not, and where and how they take the photo. And Mullarky was a portraitist, so he was very careful about like scenes. Like one of the very funny kind of funny photos in the Gallup Coal War is these two organizers who come to New Mexico to try to help the mine workers, and they're kidnapped and beaten, and they're bloodied, and Mullarky takes them into his studio and takes portraits of them as their heads are bleeding. It's the strangest photo.
It is the strangest photo. That is the photo that caught my attention first when I met with you in the archives.
Yeah.
Because of their just goofy looks on their faces.
They're just posing in a studio, like smiling like anyone would in a portrait, while their heads are just bleeding and they've got like bandages everywhere.
And bandages that you're not sure how they're attached to their heads. It's very strange.
And one of them is one of the most prominent like labor leaders in the U.S. at the time.
Yes.
So like it's like, what is happening here? Like
Yes.
at first I thought, well, he's just a portraitist and that's what he knows. That's what he does best. So he brings them into the studio. But when I looked at the rest of the photos, I saw something else. And so when I've been in the archives, there's two different things happening. When you look at photos from the intertribal ceremonial, it's a carnival. It's like this festival. And like Native people are smiling and they're having a great time and they're performing. And all you see is them, right? Like them in their outfits and group shots and individual shots, engaging in performance. You don't see the white people coming to look at them. Like viewers would just see like, oh, these are like almost ethnographic in quality. Like Edward Sheriff Curtis appears to be like documenting Native people. But like Edward Sheriff Curtis was bankrolled by J.P. Morgan. The whole point was money. That was the point with Mullarky too. I mean, like he's only going to take photos that could be monetized in the form of promotional materials or in the form of like postcards that tourists would buy when they came. And that was his job, right? They would come and he would sell them postcards and take pictures for money. But he couldn't help himself, and he took pictures of the tourists. And it's almost like pulling the curtain down. Like he takes these shots, street scenes of white people just like gawking at Native people. And it undermines the whole idea that it's anything other than a performance for tourists. It's a tourist event. End of story. And his photos like totally reveal that.
I have never made the pilgrimage to Chimayo that so many New Mexicans make each spring. But at the New Mexico History Museum last year, I could feel the power of the journey as I was immersed in the Chimayo exhibition, filled with family photographs, baby shoes, and the sounds of voices, footsteps, and singing swirling around me. Visitors at the New Mexico History Museum can expect to see exhibitions on a vast array of historical themes and topics across the state's history. Visitors can also conduct research in the Fray Angelico Chavez Library, which houses the Palace of the Governor's photo archive collection. The museum serves as a statewide educational resource and local landmark. It offers a welcoming place for visitors to explore multifaceted views on history and dialogue that bridges social and cultural divides. Learn more at nmhistorymuseum.org. Some things you can find on the internet, and others, not so much. Putting together a publication as interesting and beautiful as El Palacio magazine is hard work, but it's well worth the effort. The articles we cover offer important and insightful writing about topics you definitely won't find on the internet. I may be just a little biased, but if you love New Mexico, you'll love El Palacio. Subscribe at elpalacio.org/subscribe. I guarantee you won't want to miss an issue. Did you know? The New Mexico Culture Pass is now available to purchase online. Culture Pass gives you access to each of the 15 state museums and historic sites we feature on Encounter Culture. Reserve your Culture Pass today at nmculture.org/visit/culturepass.
Another way in which he would undermine it, there's a lot of photos that he takes that were probably the exact photos the organizing committee didn't want anyone to take. If you read like 1930s, 1940s news articles in the Gallup Independent about the intertribal ceremonial, there's often complaints. Like the newspaper will complain about all these, like, this is a common refrain, like this phrase, I'm not inventing this, the drunk Indian, right? Like all these drunk Indians in town throwing rocks at tourists. You will never find photos of this when it comes to the Gallup ceremonial. They didn't want that image depicted. It was supposed to be this tourist-friendly event. But in reality, there was a lot of opposition to the intertribal ceremonial. I've written about the intertribal ceremonial in my book, An Enemy Such as This. Really, I thought emerged in the 60s, like young Native activists in the 1960s were tired of their ceremonies and traditions being commodified and controlled by the Chamber of Commerce in Gallup, and they started protesting during the ceremonial. I wrote about that thinking at the time that this was the beginning of actual organized protests against it. But from the beginning, there were Native people that understood what was happening, didn't want to have anything to do with it, and opposed it in all kinds of ways. And one was as the Gallup Independent wrote about, I think it was in the mid-30s, they would sit under the bleachers and throwing rocks at the tourists, just to interrupt during these performances. And Mullarky has photos on the street of all of this. I mean, that would fit in the sort of frontier photography aesthetic of the victims of progress, right? There's plenty of photos of Native people, desperate, hungry, right? Or the drunk Indian. Gallup has a long history of photos of drunk Indians. But usually when those photos contribute to the frontier mythology of the West, there's usually a white person helping. It's the white people, we're just trying to help. These people are for no reason of our own, and we're going to try to help. In Mullarky's photos, he sees pictures of white people stepping over Native people on the sidewalk. He turns the lens on those. People don't care. These are not the Indians I'm here for. So they're stepping over them. They're ignoring them. There's a real kind of gritty edge to his photos. Those frontier photographies are really idealized versions of this American myth about the frontier. His aren't. There's nothing idealized. I mean, he does do the idealized versions in his official photos for the Gallup ceremonial, which is what's so interesting about Mullarky. He could toe the company line, but then he was I can't help it. I'm going to turn the camera on what these tourists are really doing. If you were Native in the 30s and 40s and 50s in Gallup, you were only welcome to the Gallup intertribal ceremonial if you were a performer. They didn't want you as a tourist. You didn't have any money. You were not welcome. He has these amazing photos of the ceremonial, from a distance, these beautiful landscape shots where he's up on a bluff looking down during the ceremonial. But unlike a lot of the photos that you see from the West, he mediates it by putting Native people in the foreground. So he has these pictures of Native people excluded from the ceremony. He's taking images from their perspective. They're in the camera, but not their faces. They're looking down where they're excluded from into this huge ceremony grounds. And so on the one hand, it's just it's a beautiful photo in that it captures everything that the intertribal ceremonial organizers would want, right? The sort of scope of it and the scale of it. But it captures it from a perspective that they were not trying to promote, right? Which is the idea of exclusion. They don't seem to be political photos in the sense that he's also really cares about this aesthetic. So his photos are beautiful. They're not just they have a point of view sometimes that appear to be his own, but they're also just beautiful. He has this ability to take street scenes of really chaotic events and make them appear as though they've been posed. That comes, I think, mostly into view when he takes photos of the organizers of the intertribal ceremony itself. So it was run by white businessmen. That was the intertribal ceremony was always a Chamber of Commerce event owned by white businessmen. Mullarky was one of them. He was one of the white businessmen who was one of the organizers. When I was looking through all of the photos of his collection, he has a lot of photos of the white men who were, the president or the various organizers of the event. And usually they're the kind of photos that those guys probably wanted taken of them, them introducing Native people or introducing ceremonies in front of the grandstand. But every now and then he's got these photos of those smoking cigars in back rooms, whispering in each other's ears. He can't help but display something going on behind the scenes. And I spent a lot of time who are these guys? And when I was able to figure out who they were by comparing photos, they were all of the wealthiest people in Gallup. And they're just cigar in their mouth, whispering in each other's ears with Native people in the background. It's fascinating. And, one of the other things he did too, which I've never seen in the sort of early 1920s and 30s from these kind of photography, was admit that these were mediated. He turned his camera on himself. Not specifically, he wasn't taking selfies.
Right.
Although that would be interesting if he had.
Yeah.
I've only ever seen one photo of him, actually. It's him in his camera shop, posing with all of his employees. He would be on the street and he would take photos on the street because a lot of the intertribal ceremonial was happening on the street. There were parades. And the whole point was to sell stuff to tourists. So there was the traders, the Indian traders were the ones who profited the most from the ceremonial because tourists would come and they would buy Indian art, and the Indian art was sold to them by white traders. And so he's taking pictures on the street of white traders selling Indian art to white people. So there's no native people involved, just their art. But he would also take pictures of native people on the street, just almost quick portraits on the street. And then he would take a picture of someone else taking a picture of the same person. So he wasn't the only photographer, right. But he was just immediately forcing a viewer who had never encountered photography or ever maybe never thought about what does it mean to take this person's portrait? I'm looking at this picture of this person. What does it mean that I'm looking at this photo? What is intended here? What am I supposed to think about this person? And all you can think when you see the next photo is oh, I'm supposed to think they're on display. They're just an object for someone to take a picture and monetize. Because all those photos appeared you could just go to the camera shop and buy the postcard or go to where the Indian traders were selling the native art. They were buying cheap and selling for more expensive. So it's also he's refusing to disguise the political economy under all of this. It's just this big business conference. This is it's a scheme. They're just trying to make a buck. I mean, that was the whole point. I mean, you can't see the photos and not suspect that Mullarky was either too good a photographer to stop himself from doing that. I think that's part of it. He was in a line of work that was fully a business. He was not an artist. The art was not a part of the equation. But he was an artist, and he saw things and wanted to depict them for what they were and couldn't help himself, and then went to the trouble of developing these things, which would not have been cheap. Had no monetary value. In fact, probably would have undermined his position in the community if he displayed these. I mean, I don't know how he got away with taking the photos that he took during the Gallup Coal War because the backlash against the miners and the miners' union was so strong. I mean, they were deporting people who were American citizens. I mean, the governor of New Mexico, a Democrat, called in the National Guard against working people who were just trying to form a union, and then arrested their organizers, U.S. citizens, and kicked them out of the state of New Mexico. And the district court in New Mexico, agreed. Yes, we should evict them from New Mexico. They have every right to do that. The governor can do that if he wants. And he took photos that undermine all of this, that made it clear, there's something not right here. And it, for his entire life and afterwards, they've been just hidden in a basement in Gallup by a guy who thought he could get tons of money. I mean, we should probably not condemn Guadagnoli, if that's how to pronounce his name, too bad, because he was just doing what camera shop owners have always done, which is if you've taken these photos, the whole point of taking the photos was to monetize them, and you get as much money as you can for them, which is what he was trying to do. But he got nothing for them until he died and they were donated.
But at this point, they're historical artifacts. And I really was intrigued by what you were saying about how any photograph is mediated by the photographer. We see what they want us to see. And that's true of any art. That's true of this podcast. But I am curious if you can talk a little bit about that in terms of these photos providing a window into a very specific time period, very specific place. And what they tell us, what they give us access to now that they are accessible to the public. And what are the missing pieces still? What are we not seeing? What are the questions that you still have after spending so much time with them?
I mean, I have nothing but questions. There's so many questions. I still really don't know much about Mullarky. His biography is just he's this out-of-town businessman, came to Gallup to make a buck, to make a living, just to, Why did his photos capture? I mean, first of all, it makes me wonder about there must be hidden archives of incredible photos documenting American life in the early 20th century that they're hidden from us.
Right.
It's a lot of work today to figure out this archive, because his goal at the time, and the goal of all of these photographers, was not to document native life or document settler society. It was just to make a buck off of it. So they didn't keep careful records. So who are these people? What year was this taken? Why did he take this photo? Did someone pay him to take this photo? Or did he take this photo of his own accord? And what did he do with it? I don't know. There's no way to know any of that. So in one way, there's very limited historical value to these photos. In some ways, all they do is kind of illustrate events that we have to find about elsewhere in the archives. In the story in El Palacio, his photos illustrate a really dramatic event in a very dramatic way. But I don't know why he took them the way he took them. I don't know, like, what were these two union organizers thinking when they decided, oh, we'll hold off going to the hospital. Let's take some portrait photos of us bleeding in this guy's camera shop first.
Right.
Like, why would they have done that? Like, he was like one of the Chamber of Commerce guys, and they were coming to fight these coal mine owners who were trying to have the people that they were working with not just beaten as a union, but deported from this country. Why were they like, oh, Mullarky, let me go with this guy? I don't know. What kind of role did he play in Gallup? Like, did he have 2 feet in different worlds? Because the people that Mullarky replaced did not have 2 feet in different worlds. Like, Simeon Schwemberger, the Catholic brother who was taking photos, was like held in low regard by Native people. He had to pay people to let him take pictures of them. In his book that UNM Press, not his book, but the book of his photos that UNM Press published about, I think 15 or so years ago, called Big Eye. Big Eye, by the way, was like the translation of the term Navajo people used. They called him Big Eye because of his, he didn't care about them unless there was a camera between him and the people. And he took photos of the Nightway ceremony, the Yebiche ceremony, the sacred Navajo winter dance. That takes like days and days to perform. You only do it one time of the year. It's not for tourists. In fact, its performance at the intertribal ceremony in the 60s was the reason why young Navajo activists confronted the intertribal ceremonial, because it was just completely a violation, and according to them, that anyone would do the Yebiche dance out of season and to tourists. He like paid people to perform it and took photos, and it's just depicted, as far as I can tell, it's the first time it was ever depicted in a photo. I think it was like 1909. And that's like a really important event, both historically important, but also important to Navajo people. And he just did it to make a buck because he wanted to make some postcards out of it. The camera shop owner was not a friend of Native people. Like, the camera shop owner in a place like Gallup was like an Indian trader, like they were your friend. You would enter into a relationship with them, and it was usually a relationship of debt. You were like pawning something or trading something, and you were rarely getting the better deal. So I don't know how to make sense of that when it comes to Mullarky.
I do want to mention, though, because we did a reading for this article in El Palacio in Gallup.
Mm-hmm.
And what was fascinating to me and really exciting and hopefully fruitful for you pursuing some of these questions, the current sheriff of Gallup was there. And so he was very invested in the sheriff's story.
He was.
And then there was a relative, right, of one of the men who had been jailed.
Yeah, they did eventually charge and convict. Well, they charged originally 48 people for the murder of the sheriff. They convicted 3 people. They went to jail. They were eventually released. And yeah, one of them was related to one of the men that was jailed. And also, the one of them was jailed. His brother was killed in the gunfight that led to the death of the sheriff. Yeah. Because it's the only on-duty death in McKinley County Sheriff Department history. Yeah, that was an interesting day, that in Gallup.
Yeah. So just to say, like, the history is very alive.
My last book is about the 1902 anthracite coal strike in Pennsylvania. And I got an email from a miner who was like relatives from someone. I mean, so there's always.
Yes.
There's always someone invested in this, no matter where it is. In Gallup in particular, because this is such a contested history. I mean, like the intertribal ceremonial, the Gallup coal strike, it's well known there. I mean, there were people there that gave tours related to this strike still today. Yeah. There are murals in Gallup devoted to this strike and the fight by the miners afterwards. It's definitely still alive.
Yeah.
It's not the past in New Mexico. It's always present in one way or another. And that's what's really so interesting in working with photos, because the photos, that's usually the one thing so difficult to find, to bring somebody who doesn't have a personal connection to these histories. Unless you have the photos that can really bring to life an event, it's hard for people to understand its significance or why that might be worth their time to pay attention to. And that's why Mullarky is so valuable. Like, he, for whatever purposes motivated him, for whatever reason he did what he did, he was able to capture the drama of like everyday moments in ways that I find rare and really exciting, like, which is not at all to minimize the primary role he played, which was to, contribute to a version and view of Native people that very much excluded them from everyday life and served to marginalize them economically, politically, culturally, and socially. So he was a very contradictory figure. And his photos somehow make him even more contradictory. Like, they're just really worth spending time on. when you see the photos, you're like, what is going on? What is that? And that's just the lure to get people.
Right.
Like, I guess we're just like Mullarky. We're using photos as a lure. I mean, his photos remain a lure. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. So I know you said you have nothing but questions, but I am curious because this is something I think about all the time. Every single issue of El Palacio that I edit, I think about what is missing, the gaps in the archive, and the very interesting ways that different writers and historians approach that problem. So I'm curious about how you deal with that.
As I said at the beginning, most of my work is archival. Like when I tell stories, I go in the archive. And so there's always gaps. And particularly when you work with archival material, you're often introduced to a story from a particular perspective. And usually in the archives, it's like the perspective of the people who had the means to leave a paper trail. And that's never usually working people. Maybe it's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to stories of like organized labor and the struggles of organized labor is because they're one of the few times that regular working people leave a paper trail.
Yeah.
I tried to take that perspective in telling the story in El Palacio by using Mullarky's photos as my guide. One of the things that he centers in his photos is regular people. There's this great photo from Kitchen's Opera House of the moment when the union members voted to go on strike. And there must be 100, 200 people in the Opera House all raising their hands and for strike. And they're almost entirely women and children.
Yeah.
And then there's photos of the organizers, and the photo is always Martha Roberts. So here's a story about a strike run by a woman and fought by women and children.
Right.
And so that's the story. Because that's not how the story has been told by stories in the past. Historians tell stories about strikes. It's always like strike leaders and politicians and their negotiations.
Right.
No one's told the story of the Gallup Coal Strike by focusing on Martha Roberts and just the everyday folks who fought the strike. And those are the photos that Mullarky left us. And also, like, when he took pictures of the militia, it was of individual militia members. He caught their faces, like individual people who were just forced to come and point guns at their neighbors. And so I spent a lot of time doing biographical work about Martha Roberts.
Right.
And who were these people that were being deported? And, like, what were their stories? And that's a really difficult thing to do when, in any other context, I've found, unless it's some sort of official thing that forced them to tell their stories in official capacities. So they gave testimony in court hearings. They were hauled before judges and had to give testimony. And so I could find their words. So I could tell the story from their perspective. That's one of the ways that I try to fill the gaps by, like, knowing that their stories are somewhere. I have to go find it. You can't just rely on the official archives. You've got to burrow your way underneath them. And there's always an underneath. Mullarky gave us some hints, and so I just followed his hints.
Any last things you want to say about Mullarky or anything else that we've covered?
The only thing I would say, this is so worth spending time on.
Yeah.
This photo like would really, I think, fill a gap in New Mexico history. This is your gap question. I'll come back to that, which is this is a version of New Mexico that puts Boosterism at the heart of so much of New Mexico's official history right on display. Like, there's great books like Chris Wilson's The Myth of Santa Fe that do it, but there's not a lot of histories that can do it so powerfully like Mullarky's photos can do, and just put everything on display all at once and force us to grapple with what it means to live in a state built this way by these people.
If this episode has left you itching to see Mullarky's photos, check them out in David's article in the fall 2025 issue of El Palacio. The link is in the show notes. We've also linked to the Palace of the Governor's photo archives, which contains a wealth of images from 1845 to the present of New Mexico and the greater Southwest. Thanks for listening. Encounter Culture is a production of the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. Our producer is Andrea Klunder at the Creative Imposter Studios. This season is produced and edited by Andrea Klunder and Alex Riegler, with additional editing by Monica Brain. Our recording engineers are Colin Underleiter and Cabby at Cabby Sound Studios in Santa Fe. Technical direction and post-production audio by Edwin R. Ruiz. Our executive producer is Daniel Zillman. Thank you to New Mexico artist El Brujo de Santinava for our theme music. For a full transcript and show notes, visit podcast.nmculture.org or click the link in the episode description in your listening app. I'm your host, Emily Withnall. The New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs is your guide to the state's entire family of museums, historic sites, and cultural institutions. From native treasures to space exploration, world-class folk art to ancient dinosaurs, our favorite way to fully explore is with the New Mexico Culture Pass. To see everywhere Culture Pass is accepted and reserve yours today, visit nmculture.org/visit/culturepass. And if you love New Mexico, you'll love El Palacio magazine. Subscribe at elpalacio.org. Thank you for listening. And if you learned something new, send this episode to a friend or share it on social media. We love celebrating the cultures of New Mexico together.